There is a moment, late at night, when most people lie awake replaying something they said hours ago. A comment that came out sharper than they meant. A silence they filled with an excuse instead of the truth. A smile they gave someone they were secretly angry with. I want to tell you about one such night. A man named David, not his real name, but his story is real enough, sat in his car outside his own house for almost 20 minutes before going inside. He had just left a dinner with his closest friends. On the surface, nothing had gone wrong. Everyone laughed. Everyone hugged goodbye. And yet David felt a hollow, gnawing shame he couldn't explain. It wasn't until he sat in the silence of that car that he understood why. His friend Rahul had announced a promotion that evening, the kind of promotion David had quietly wanted for himself for 2 years. And David had smiled. He had said, "Congratulations, man, you deserve it." He had meant it on the surface, but underneath something colder had stirred. A tightness in his chest, a voice that whispered, "Why him and not you?" David was not a bad man, he loved his friend. But for one fraction of a second, something ancient and uninvited had taken the wheel, something that had nothing to do with who David wanted to be, and everything to do with instincts buried so deep he didn't even know they were there. This is not a story about David. It is a story about you, about me, about every person who has ever felt a flash of anger they couldn't justify, a pull towards someone they knew was wrong for them, a need to be right in an argument that didn't matter. Or a strange comfort in staying small so no one would ever be threatened by them. We like to believe we are rational creatures, that we think then act, that our choices are ours alone, made in the clear light of reason. But underneath the surface of every decision, every relationship, every quiet resentment, and every burst of unexplainable joy, there is a second mind at work. Older than language, older than logic. A mind shaped over hundreds of thousands of years, built for survival in a world that no longer exists, and yet it still drives the world we live in today. This is a book about that second mind. It is a book about the instincts that move through every human being on this earth. The pride that protects us and destroys us, the envy we deny even to ourselves, the fear that dresses itself up as anger. The need to belong that can make us abandon who we are. Once you learn to see these forces, you cannot unsee them, not in others, and most uncomfortably not in yourself. So take a breath, settle in. What you are about to hear may, at times, feel like I am speaking directly about your own life. That is not a coincidence. That is the point. Chapter 1, The Force of the Unseen Mind. There is an old belief, comforting in its simplicity, that human beings are creatures of reason. That we weigh evidence, consider consequences, and arrive at conclusions the way a judge arrives at a verdict, carefully, impartially, in full possession of the facts. It is a beautiful idea. It is also, almost entirely, a myth. Beneath every reasoned decision you believe you have made, there is a current of emotion that arrived first, and reason, more often than not, is simply called in afterward to build a respectable case for what emotion had already decided. Let me tell you about a woman named Mira. Mira was, by every account, an intelligent and thoughtful person. She worked as an accountant, a profession that rewarded precision and cool-headed logic. Her colleagues trusted her judgment. Her family relied on her for the sensible choice in every crisis. Mira fell in love with a man named Arjun. Everyone around her, her sister, her closest friend, even a small, quiet voice inside her own chest, noticed the same troubling pattern. Arjun would disappear for days without explanation. He would return full of charm, full of apology, full of promises, and each time Mira welcomed him back. Her sister once asked her gently, "Why do you keep forgiving him?" Mira gave a long, articulate answer. She spoke about his difficult childhood. She spoke about how people deserve second chances. She spoke about growth, about patience, about the complexity of love. It was, on its surface, a reasonable answer. Mira was, after all, a reasonable woman, but it was not the true answer. The true answer lived somewhere Mira could not easily reach with words, in a memory of her father who had also disappeared for days at a time when she was a child, and who she had also each time forgiven. Because forgiving him was the only way a small girl knew how to keep loving a parent who kept leaving. That old, wordless pattern had been running quietly beneath the surface of Mira's mind for over 20 years. It did not ask her permission before it shaped her choices. It simply acted and left her intelligent, rational mind to explain the acting afterward. This is the first and most humbling truth about human nature. Our emotions do not wait for our permission, and they very rarely announce themselves honestly. They arrive disguised as logic, as loyalty, as love, as principle. And by the time we notice them, we have already built an entire structure of reasoning on top of them, a structure so convincing that even we ourselves are fooled. Consider how differently we judge the same action depending on who commits it. If a stranger cuts in front of you in traffic, you assume they are careless, even cruel. If you cut in front of someone else because you are late for something important, you assume the world will understand, that surely they can see you had no choice. The action is identical. The story we tell about it changes entirely depending on whose action it is. This is not a flaw limited to weak or foolish people. It is a structural feature of every human mind, including the sharpest and most disciplined ones. The philosopher who writes brilliantly about objectivity still flinches at criticism of his own work. The doctor who lectures patients about willpower still reaches for a cigarette when her own stress becomes unbearable. Knowledge of a pattern does not automatically grant freedom from it. Only awareness, practiced consistently and honestly, begins to loosen its grip. Why does the mind work this way? Consider, for a moment, what emotion actually is. Long before humans had language, long before we had the luxury of sitting and weighing options, our ancestors needed to make instant decisions that meant the difference between living and dying. A rustle in the grass had to trigger fear immediately. There was no time to reason through the probability that it was merely wind. A threat to the group had to trigger anger immediately. There was no time to hold a committee meeting on the appropriate response. Emotion is fast. Emotion is old. Reason, by comparison, is a relatively new and much slower tool bolted on top of a much older engine. That engine has not disappeared simply because we now live in offices instead of forests, in cities instead of tribes. It runs constantly, beneath everything, coloring how we interpret a colleague's tone of voice, how we read a delay in someone's text message reply, how we decide in half a second whether a stranger's face seems trustworthy or not. The goal of understanding this force is not to distrust your emotions, nor to try to eliminate them. That would be both impossible and unwise, for emotion also carries wisdom that pure logic cannot reach. The goal is far more modest and far more powerful, to notice the moment emotion arrives before it disguises itself as certainty. To ask quietly in the middle of a strong reaction, what is actually driving this, before building an elaborate justification on top of it. Mira, in the end, did not change because someone convinced her with a clever argument. Arguments rarely reach the part of the mind where these patterns live. She changed the night she finally allowed herself to sit with an uncomfortable question her sister had asked, without immediately reaching for an explanation. She let the silence stretch. And in that silence, for the first time, she felt the old grief of a little girl waiting by a window, rather than the reasonable voice of an adult accountant. That feeling, once actually felt instead of explained away, began, slowly, imperfectly, to loosen its hold on her choices. This is the work ahead of us in this book. Not to become emotionless calculators, which is neither possible nor desirable, but to become people who can recognize the moment the old, unseen mind takes the wheel, and who can, with practice, choose to drive a little more consciously ourselves. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through the specific instincts that shape human behavior, the pride that both builds and destroys us, the envy we are trained to deny, the fear that hides inside anger, the deep and often unconscious need to belong. Each one operates by its own logic. Each one has shaped history, relationships, and quiet private moments in car seats outside homes, all around the world, every single night. Understanding them will not make you immune to being human, but it will make you far harder to be ruled, unknowingly, by forces you never chose. Chapter 2, the mirror trap. Every person you will ever meet is, in some quiet corner of themselves, asking the same silent question. Do I matter? Most of us learn early in childhood clever ways to answer that question for ourselves. Some of us learn to answer it through achievement. Some through charm. Some through being needed or being right or being the one who suffers the most or the one who never needs anyone at all. These early answers harden over years into something we carry everywhere, a fragile, invisible structure we spend our whole lives protecting, often without knowing we are protecting anything at all. I want to tell you about a man named Sanjay. Sanjay ran a small but respected design studio. He was talented, genuinely, undeniably talented, and he had built a small team of young designers who admired him. In client meetings, Sanjay was magnetic. He spoke with total conviction. He rarely apologized. When a project succeeded, he told the story of his own vision, his own instinct, his own hard-won taste. When a project failed, the story shifted. It became about a difficult client, a junior designer who hadn't executed properly, market conditions no one could have predicted. For years, this worked well enough. Sanjay's confidence was, in its way, part of what made people trust him, but something began to shift in the studio. Talented designers stopped staying long. In their exit conversations, a pattern quietly repeated itself, though no one said it directly to Sanjay's face. He takes the credit, and he cannot survive being disagreed with. The truth was more tender than the accusation suggested. Sanjay had grown up as the middle child of a father who praised only results, never effort, and who compared his three sons constantly against one another. Praise in that house was a scarce resource, handed out only to whoever had won that week. Sanjay had learned, very young, that being ordinary was dangerous. That safety came only from being exceptional, and that any acknowledgement of failure was, in some deep and childlike part of him, equivalent to losing his father's love all over again. By the time Sanjay became an adult, he was no longer aware that any of this was happening. All he knew was a feeling, sharp, immediate, almost physical, whenever someone questioned his work. That feeling was not really about the work at all. It was the echo of a much older fear, dressed up as professional confidence. This is what I call the mirror trap, a way of moving through the world in which other people stop being fully real and instead become surfaces on which we check our own reflection. Are they impressed? Are they loyal? Are they agreeing? When someone in Sanjay's orbit disagreed with him, some part of him did not experience it as a difference of opinion between two separate people. It registered as a crack in the mirror itself, a threat to the only self he knew how to be. We tend to think of this pattern as belonging only to the obviously arrogant, the loud, the self-important. But the mirror trap wears many disguises, and some of the most exhausting ones are quiet. The person who constantly self-deprecates, fishing for reassurance, is often standing in front of the same mirror, simply checking it from a different angle. The person who cannot celebrate a friend's success without quickly mentioning their own recent achievement is checking the mirror too. Even the person who insists they don't care what anyone thinks of them is, very often, still organizing their entire identity around that very question, simply answering it with defiance instead of hunger. None of this makes a person a villain. It makes them human. Nearly everyone carries some version of this mirror, inherited from whatever taught them early on that love and safety were conditional on being seen a certain way. The danger is not that the mirror exists. The danger is mistaking the reflection for reality, building an entire life, an entire set of relationships around the frantic management of how one appears, rather than the quieter, harder work of who one actually is. There is a particular moment worth watching for in yourself and in others, the moment right after a mistake is pointed out. Watch what happens in that half second. Does the mind reach immediately for an explanation that protects the reflection? It wasn't really my fault. They misunderstood me. This isn't a fair criticism. Or can it, even briefly, sit with the plain and unglamorous fact of having simply been wrong? That half second is where the mirror trap lives or loosens. Sanjay's turning point did not come from a lecture about humility. It came almost accidentally on an evening when a young designer on his team quit, and in her final message to him, wrote simply, "I stopped feeling safe bringing you my ideas because I was never sure if you wanted them to be good or wanted them to be yours." He read that message perhaps 30 times. He wanted at first to be angry at her for being unfair. But somewhere around the 15th reading, underneath the anger, he felt something else, a small, old ache, oddly familiar, that had nothing to do with her at all. He did not become a different man overnight, but he began, slowly, to notice the mirror, to notice the tightening in his chest when a young designer suggested a change to his layout, to notice how badly he wanted in that moment to explain why he was right, and to occasionally, deliberately, choose silence instead and simply listen. This is the real work the mirror trap asks of us. Not to stop caring how we are seen. That instinct is too deeply human to erase, and it is not entirely a flaw. It connects us to community, to standards, to belonging. The work is to notice when the need to be reflected favorably has quietly taken priority over truth, over connection, over the people standing in front of us, who are not mirrors at all, but entire worlds of their own. The people who unsettle us most, who irritate us far beyond what the moment seems to warrant, are very often showing us where our own mirror is most fragile. And the people we find ourselves endlessly needing to impress are very often showing us exactly which old, unanswered question we are still, quietly, trying to settle. Chapter 3. The fire within anger rarely announces its true name. It arrives instead disguised as impatience, as sarcasm, as a headache that appears the moment a difficult conversation begins, as exhaustion that has no clear physical cause. It shows up in the sharpness of a reply to a text message, in the slamming of a car door slightly harder than necessary, in the silence a person offers instead of the sentence they are actually holding back. I want to tell you about a woman named Priya. Priya was known among her friends and family as endlessly patient. She was the one who stayed calm during arguments, who absorbed other people's frustration without complaint, who could be counted on to smooth things over. Her mother used to say with unmistakable pride, "Priya never raises her voice." What her mother did not know, what Priya herself barely knew, was the cost of that reputation. Priya had grown up in a house where her father's anger arrived without warning, loud and frightening, and where the household had organized itself, silently and completely, around the single goal of never triggering it. Priya learned, long before she had the words to describe what she was learning, that her own anger was a luxury the family could not afford. There was only room for one person's feelings in that house, and it was not going to be hers. So Priya became, in a sense, extremely skilled at something most people never have to master, the disappearance of her own anger before it ever reached the surface. Not the healthy management of anger, the actual erasure of it so thorough that by adulthood she genuinely believed she rarely felt angry at all, but feelings that are not expressed do not vanish. They relocate. Priya's anger relocated into her body, arriving as tension headaches that no doctor could fully explain. It relocated into her friendships, arriving as a quiet resentment she couldn't name toward friends who asked too much of her, and received, each time, a warm and generous yes, followed by hours of private, unspoken bitterness she would never have admitted to feeling. It relocated into her marriage, arriving as a coldness that would descend over her for days after an argument she had, on the surface, calmly agreed to let go of. Her husband once asked her during one of these cold stretches, "Are you angry with me?" "No," Priya said, and she meant it entirely. She was not lying. She simply no longer had reliable access to the truth of her own anger. It had been rerouted so early and so completely that it now traveled underground, emerging only in forms disguised enough to seem like something else: fatigue, withdrawal, a headache, a sharper tone she didn't quite recognize as her own. This is one of the great, quiet costs of a certain kind of upbringing, a certain kind of culture, a certain kind of personal history. Not the presence of anger which every human being carries, but the loss of a person's relationship to their own anger. And a feeling we cannot recognize in ourselves does not become weaker for being hidden. It becomes, if anything, more unpredictable because it is no longer being consciously felt or examined. It is simply leaking in whatever direction offers the least resistance. There is an important distinction worth making here, one that took Priya years to understand. The goal is never to become an angrier person or to start expressing every flash of irritation without restraint. That would trade one imbalance for another. The goal is far more precise, to develop an honest relationship with the feeling itself, so that it can be recognized, named, and metabolized consciously, rather than expressed sideways, through the body, through silence, through a coldness that punishes without ever explaining what it is punishing for. Priya's shift began in an ordinary therapy session, when her therapist asked a simple question she had never once been asked in 34 years of life. "What did you want to say to your father in those moments that you couldn't say?" Priya opened her mouth to answer with something reasonable, something forgiving, something in keeping with the patient woman everyone knew her to be. Instead, she cried for almost 20 minutes without saying anything at all. What surfaced afterward was not rage, though rage was somewhere in it. It was grief for a small girl who had never been allowed the ordinary, healthy anger of childhood. The kind that teaches a person where their own boundaries are. The kind that says, simply and without apology, that was not okay. Learning to feel her own anger at this stage of her life did not turn Priya into someone harsh or unkind. If anything, it made her gentler because she was no longer managing a hidden pressure that leaked out sideways into the people she loved most. She began to notice the tension headache arriving, and instead of pushing through it, she would ask herself, quietly, what am I not letting myself feel right now? Often there was an answer. Often the answer was anger, small, reasonable, entirely legitimate anger about something that truly did deserve a response. The fire within is not the enemy. Repression is not the same as peace, no matter how peaceful it may look from the outside. A person who has simply buried their anger deep enough to stop noticing it is not calm. They are only quiet, and quiet, held for long enough, tends eventually to find its own way out, usually in a place and a manner far less controlled than if it had simply been allowed to speak honestly in the first place. The work, then, is not to extinguish this fire, nor to let it burn unchecked. It is to build deliberately an honest relationship with it, to notice it early, to name it accurately, and to give it a voice before it finds one for itself in a headache. In a silence, in a coldness that someone we love will spend days trying and failing to understand. Chapter 4. The approval trap. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. It is the exhaustion of a person who has spent their entire life reading rooms, sensing shifts in mood before anyone speaks, adjusting their opinions half a second before offering them, calibrating their own laughter to match the exact temperature of the group around them. I want to tell you about a man named Karen. Karen was, by every outward measure, well liked. He was the friend everyone invited, the colleague everyone wanted on their team, the son every relative praised at family gatherings. And yet Karen could not, if pressed, easily answer a simple question. What do you actually think? Not what does his boss think he should think. Not what would his friends expect him to think. Not what would keep the peace at dinner. What did Karen himself actually believe, want, feel? The question would sit there, oddly difficult, like reaching for a muscle that had never once been used. Karen had grown up as the youngest of 4 siblings in a household that prized harmony above almost everything else. Disagreement in that house was treated as a kind of quiet emergency, something to be smoothed over quickly, apologized for, resolved before bedtime. Karen learned, early and thoroughly, that being agreeable was the surest path to being loved. He became remarkably good at sensing what a room wanted from him, and remarkably good at becoming it. This served him well for years. It served him right up until the evening his closest friend asked him to be a witness in a serious dispute with a business partner. A dispute in which Karen had, in fact, seen something the friend hadn't. He had overheard a conversation, months earlier, that directly contradicted what the business partner was now claiming in front of a room full of people. Karen felt the truth rise in his chest. He also felt instantly and powerfully the old and familiar pull, the pull toward keeping the room comfortable, toward not being the person who caused friction, toward letting the moment pass with a vague and diplomatic non-answer. He chose the vague answer. His friend lost that dispute. And though his friend never fully learned what Karen had witnessed, Karen knew. He carried that knowledge home that night and sat with a feeling far heavier than the discomfort he had avoided in the room, the particular corrosive shame of having betrayed not his friend exactly, but something quieter and more fundamental, his own knowledge of what was true. This is the hidden cost of a life organized around approval. It is not that such a life is without rewards. It very often is rewarded richly and consistently with likability, with smooth relationships, with the genuine warmth of people who find you easy to be around. The cost is paid elsewhere, in a currency that takes years to notice it's being spent. The slow erosion of a person's ability to know, with any confidence, what they themselves actually think. We are, all of us, social creatures by design, not by weakness. For most of human history, exclusion from the group meant death, quite literally. No lone individual survived long on the ancient plains without the protection of others. The instinct to read a room, to sense disapproval, to adjust behavior in order to remain safely inside the circle of belonging, is not a character flaw. It is an inheritance, carried in the body of every person who ever lived long enough to have descendants. The trouble begins when this ancient survival instinct tuned for a world of literal physical danger is applied without discernment to a modern world made mostly of harmless disagreements. A friend's differing opinion about a film, a colleague's pushback on a proposal. A stranger's disapproval that will be forgotten by both parties within the hour. The nervous system, however, often cannot tell the difference. A raised eyebrow from a coworker can trigger something in the body nearly identical to what our ancestors felt facing exile from the tribe. Karen's shift did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, though the dispute with his friend planted the first seed. It arrived slowly, through small and almost invisible acts of practice. He began deliberately to voice a mild disagreement in low-stakes conversations. Which restaurant to choose, which route to take, small enough that the consequence of disapproval, if it came, would be survivable and quickly forgotten. He noticed each time the flush of anxiety that rose in his chest the moment before speaking, and he noticed afterward that the room did not collapse, that people did not stop loving him. That disagreement, in most ordinary moments, is simply disagreement, not the emergency his childhood had trained him to fear. Over time, this small, deliberate practice built something Karen had never had reliable access to before. An actual, felt sense of his own opinions, separate from the opinions of whoever happened to be in the room with him. The work here is not to become disagreeable, nor to mistake stubbornness for authenticity. Plenty of people mask a desperate need for approval by performing the opposite, loudly contrarian. Always the one to push back, still, underneath it all. Organizing their entire identity around how they are perceived, simply from the opposite angle. The real work is quieter and harder to fake. To know in any given moment whether the thing about to be said is the truth, or merely the thing most likely to keep the room warm. That single small pause, the half-second before speaking, in which a person can ask themselves, is this what I think? Or is this what will be well received? Is where an entire life of quiet self-abandonment can slowly begin to reverse. Chapter 5. The Green-Eyed Shad. Of all the feelings a person is likely to hide from themselves, envy may be the most thoroughly disguised. Anger, at least, is often permitted to show itself openly. Grief is granted a certain social dignity. But envy, the raw, uncomfortable sting of wanting what someone else has, and resenting them faintly for having it, is rarely spoken aloud, even in the privacy of one's own thoughts. Most people would sooner admit to almost any other flaw than confess, plainly, I am envious of you. I want to tell you about two sisters, Anjali and Neha. Anjali was the elder by 3 years, and had spent much of her adult life quietly, steadily building a career in public health meaningful work, but slow, unglamorous, the kind that rarely draws attention or applause. Neha, the younger sister, had taken a different path entirely, into a fast-growing business that had, within a few short years, made her locally well-known, financially comfortable, and a frequent subject of admiring conversation at family gatherings. Anjali loved her sister. This was true, and it remained true throughout everything that follows. But at Neha's engagement party, when a distant aunt loudly praised Neha's success in front of the entire gathered family, Anjali felt something twist sharply in her chest. Something she immediately, almost reflexively, buried beneath a warm smile and a proud, congratulatory hug. She told herself that night and for months afterward that she felt nothing but happiness for her sister, and in the sense that Anjali consciously wished Neha well, this was true. But beneath that conscious wish, something else had quietly taken root, a small, persistent habit of finding fault with Neha's choices. Anjali began, without quite noticing she was doing it, to mention to friends that Neha's business seemed to be growing a bit too fast, honestly, or that Neha didn't seem as grounded as she used to be. None of these comments were dramatic. None of them on their own seemed like anything other than sisterly concern. But taken together over months, they formed a pattern, a quiet, persistent chipping away at her sister's happiness, offered always in the gentle language of love. This is how envy most often operates in ordinary life. It rarely appears as outright hostility. It appears as subtle diminishment, a compliment delivered with a small qualifier attached a piece of unsolicited advice, offered at exactly the moment someone else is celebrating a story told about a person's success that somehow always includes the detail of their luck, or their privilege or the help they received, as though these details were necessary corrections to an account that might otherwise seem too generous. The reason envy hides itself so thoroughly, even from the person feeling it, is that admitting to it feels like admitting something shameful about our own sense of worth, an acknowledgement that we measure ourselves against others, and that in this particular comparison we have come up short. Few admissions feel more uncomfortable than that one. And so the mind, protective as ever, finds a way to convert the discomfort of envy into something more palatable. Righteous concern, mild criticism, a story about the other person's flaws rather than a story about our own longing. Anjali's turning point came unexpectedly through her own daughter. She overheard her 10-year-old telling a friend with obvious pride, "My aunt is so successful, she started her own company," and something about hearing this small, uncomplicated admiration, free of any of the qualifiers Anjali herself had grown practiced at adding, struck her with sudden and uncomfortable clarity. Her daughter saw Neha's success simply, without threat, without needing to diminish it in order to feel secure. Anjali realized, with a discomfort she couldn't immediately shake, that she had lost that same simple capacity somewhere along the way. She did not resolve this by forcing herself to feel nothing but happiness. Feelings rarely respond well to being commanded. Instead, she began doing something smaller and considerably more honest. Each time she noticed the urge to mention a flaw in Neha's success, she paused and asked herself privately, is this actually about her? Or is it about something I want for myself and haven't found a way to pursue? The honest answer, more often than not, was the second one. Anjali had, for years, quietly wanted more public recognition for her own work in public health, work that mattered enormously, but was rarely celebrated the way Neha's business achievements were. Once she allowed herself to name that longing directly, rather than routing it sideways into subtle criticism of her sister, something eased. The envy did not disappear entirely. It rarely does entirely. Being as old and stubborn an instinct as any other, but it stopped disguising itself as concern and started being recognized for what it actually was. A signal pointing toward something Anjali herself still wanted rather than a verdict on her sister's worthiness of success. This is, in the end, the most useful thing envy can offer, once it is honestly acknowledged rather than converted into quiet criticism: information. Envy points, with striking accuracy, toward what a person actually values and quietly longs for, even when, especially when, they have not admitted this longing to themselves. The sting of someone else's success is rarely random. It lands hardest exactly where our own unspoken wants are waiting, unexamined, in the dark. The invitation, then, is not to eliminate envy, which may not be possible and may not even be desirable since it carries real information about the self. The invitation is to catch it early, before it disguises itself as a critique of someone else, and to ask honestly what it is actually pointing toward, and then having named it clearly to consider what small real step might be taken toward that longing, rather than spending that same energy chipping quietly away at someone else's joy. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Self-Sabotage. There is a peculiar kind of frustration that comes from watching yourself do, again, the very thing you swore you would never do again. I want to tell you about a man named Vikram. Vikram was a talented writer who had, for nearly a decade, dreamed of finishing a novel. He would begin with real excitement, outlining chapters, writing furiously for 2 or 3 weeks. And then, without fail, somewhere around the point where the work began to matter most, where a real deadline or a real submission loomed, something in him would quietly pull the plug. He would find an urgent distraction. He would convince himself the draft wasn't ready, that it needed another 6 months of thinking. He would, in effect, set fire to his own momentum every single time just before it could carry him somewhere genuinely uncertain. For years, Vikram assumed this was simple laziness or a lack of discipline. It was neither. It was something far more precise and far more protective. Vikram had grown up with a father who measured his worth almost entirely through achievement, and who had a way of responding to any real success with a faint, deflating comment, "Good, now don't get lazy," that somehow made triumph feel more dangerous than failure. Somewhere in that childhood a quiet equation had formed. Real success invites real scrutiny, and real scrutiny is unbearable. Failure, by contrast, was familiar and survivable. Vikram had failed before and lived through it. He had never actually succeeded at the thing he most wanted. and some old, protective part of him had no evidence that he would survive that either. So each time Vikram approached the edge of real success, an ancient alarm went off, not consciously, not in words, but as a feeling of dread disguised as boredom, as sudden distraction, as a conviction that the work simply wasn't good enough yet. Self-sabotage in this light is rarely a wish to fail. It is almost always a wish to remain safe, and safety, to a mind shaped by Vikram's particular history, meant staying inside the boundary of the known, however unhappy that boundary might be. The turning point for Vikram came from a small, unglamorous practice. Each time he felt the pull to abandon a project right before it mattered, he began writing down, honestly, what he imagined would happen if he finished it and it succeeded. Not the vague fear, but the specific, imagined scene. What he found, again and again, was not a fear of failure at all. It was a fear of being truly seen, of a success so real that it could no longer be waved away, and that would leave him, for the first time, without the old and familiar shelter of "I never really tried." Self-sabotage is rarely stupidity. It is usually an old and outdated strategy, once genuinely protective, still running long after the danger it was built for has passed. Chapter 7. The Illusion of Control. There is a particular confidence that feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from competence, and only reveals its true nature after the damage is done. I want to tell you about a woman named Ritu. Ritu had built a small but thriving catering business through genuine skill and years of hard work. Her early success, however, produced an unintended side effect, a growing certainty that her instincts were simply correct, more often and more reliably than the instincts of the people around her. When her operations manager warned her against expanding into a much larger, much riskier event space, Ritu dismissed the concern politely but firmly. She had, after all, been right before. The expansion failed expensively and publicly within 8 months. What makes this pattern so persistent is that early success genuinely does teach real lessons. Ritu's instincts had, in many cases, actually been sound. The danger arrives when a person mistakes a specific, hard-won expertise for a general infallibility, applying the confidence earned in one narrow domain to decisions in entirely different territory, where the same instincts no longer apply. Ritu's recovery began not with humility lectures, but with a simple discipline she adopted afterward. Before any major decision, she now deliberately sought out the person in the room most likely to disagree with her, and genuinely listened, rather than simply waiting for her turn to explain why she was right. Confidence, she came to understand, is most dangerous not when it is loud, but when it becomes so comfortable that it stops checking itself against reality at all. Chapter 8. The weight of the past. Some patterns are not learned in a single dramatic moment. They are absorbed slowly over years, the way a plant grows toward whatever light is available without ever consciously choosing to. I want to tell you about a man named Rohan. Rohan found himself, well into his 30s, repeatedly drawn to relationships and friendships with people who needed rescuing, people in crisis. People whose lives were in some state of collapse that only Rohan, it seemed, had the patience to help repair. Each time he told himself this was simply generosity, and it was in part. But it was also something older. Rohan had grown up as the eldest child of a mother who struggled with periods of deep emotional distress, and who had, without meaning to, made young Rohan responsible for managing her moods long before he had the emotional tools to manage his own. He had learned as a child that his value lay in being needed by someone who was struggling. That pattern, formed decades earlier, was still quietly choosing his relationships for him. Understanding this did not mean blaming his mother, nor did it mean abandoning his genuine capacity for care. It meant, slowly, learning to notice the difference between choosing someone because he loved them and choosing someone because rescuing them was the only role in which he had ever felt secure. Chapter 9. The art of reading people. Most people believe they already read others well. In truth, most people mainly read the story they expect to see and mistake that story for observation. I want to tell you about a woman named Farah, who worked in human resources and prided herself on her ability to judge character quickly. For years, this instinct served her, until she hired a candidate who interviewed beautifully, said all the right things about teamwork and humility, and turned out within months to be quietly undermining colleagues behind their backs. Farah's mistake was not carelessness. It was that she had listened almost entirely to what the candidate said and paid very little attention to smaller, more reliable signals. How he spoke about former colleagues when he thought it didn't matter how he treated the receptionist on his way out. The small flicker of impatience when a question challenged him rather than flattered him. Words are cheap and easily rehearsed. Behavior, especially in small, low-stakes moments when a person believes no one important is watching, is far harder to fake. Learning to read people well is less about clever intuition and more about patient attention to these unguarded moments, and about noticing, honestly, when our own hopes about a person are quietly editing what we allow ourselves to see. Chapter 10. The Path to Mastery. We end where every chapter in this book has, in its own way, been pointing, toward the quiet, difficult, lifelong work of self-awareness. None of the patterns described in these pages, the unseen currents beneath our reasoning the mirror we check ourselves against the fire we bury. The approval we chase, the envy we disguise, the sabotage we mistake for laziness, the false confidence of past success, the old wounds still steering present, choices, the stories we mistake for observation. None of these disappear simply because we have named them once. They loosen slowly through repeated, honest attention. Through the willingness, again and again, to pause in the half-second before a reaction and ask, quietly, what is actually driving this? Through the humility to admit, each time an old pattern resurfaces, that recognizing it once was never going to be enough, that this is not a problem solved, but a practice returned to for as long as we are alive. This is not a comfortable kind of mastery. It offers no final certificate, no moment of arrival. What it offers instead is something quieter and, in the end, more valuable. The chance to be less often ruled by forces we never chose, and to meet the people in our lives, and the person we ourselves are, with a little more honesty than the day before. That is the work. It was always the work.